So thanks very much. I'm very happy to take questions, or more importantly, get answers.
Thank you very much. But just remind you all that this event is recorded and later on would be available as a webcast on the website. We're just taking any question and answer. It would be great if you can introduce yourself, name and affiliation. So anyone can go.
I'm John Kelly. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post, and I'm at the Reuters Institute here at Oxford this year. And thank you, Charlie, for giving that overview. I'm going to mix a bunch of metaphors as I try to throw some questions out. Andrew Keen talks about us sort of drowning in this sea of dross as a result of these technologies that intersect with some of what you're talking about. But one of the problems seems to be not that there's too much of this, but that there's too little. Or right now, something like the BBC website, a figure I saw was, 1% of its audience is actually contributing in some way to the Have Your Say portion of the website. How that's a self-selected group. How do you keep network journalism or super media from moving from one group of elites to another, or just opening that circle but not really opening it that widely? And if to do so, what you have to do is sort of shade over into what in America we called public journalism for a while. That is, having town hall meetings, inviting readers into focus groups. If you're just doing sort of a digital version of that, is that changing what the role of the journalist, at least in the U.S., has been, which is, hey, we're just going to tell you what's going on, and we're not going to sit down at the same table, because in doing that, that threatens to alter our journalism in a way. So I'm curious about those two things. How do you keep it from just being an elite thing? And does this require more than just knowing Flash and podcasting and having reporters who know how to use camcorders? Does it mean we need to think differently as journalists, not just getting the story, but sort of going beyond that and involving the audience in a way that maybe we haven't been comfortable with in the past?
Yeah. I'm not sure how starry-eyed and idealistic I come across. Those who know me know I'm not. And in a sense, where I would differentiate myself from, even Dan Gillmor and certainly Joe Trippi and so on, is that I don't see anything, inevitable about all this. I don't think, unlike Joe Trippi, for example, I don't think that the world is going to change and politics is going to change, certainly not very soon, in some wonderful revolution, because there is that potential. I think you're right that one of the fascinating things about the way that people have become involved in the new media generally, and specifically in journalism, is how, you could argue, how little there has been. And I think there's a very common sense reason for that, which is that most people don't want to be journalists. Most people want to live their lives. They've got far more interesting things to do. I think the problem is, you're quite right, the problem is the other way round, in a sense, that, okay, there's a flood of material whenever the BBC says, send us your photos about the floods, or, but generally speaking, the 60–80% of news data will still be produced because people want it produced, in the same way that you don't want to all grow your own vegetables. You want supermarkets. And I think network journalism speaks much more about the idea that journalism continues but will be changed and altered. Not that suddenly the newsrooms are going to be emptied of hacks and that the public are going to be suddenly sitting at the PCs and taking over the airwaves. Because I think that mean, I was at a conference recently with a bunch of local journalists who were doing some fantastic cutting-edge work on micro local news sites, and their main problem was that people weren't posting on them, people weren't commenting on them, people weren't doing much stuff on them, you know. And I think that was partly because they were feeling their way forward and trying to come up with the techniques and so on. But I think it's more about the idea of relevance. If you think about it, most local papers were not created because people wanted to, because, you know, the local news guy wanted to share a load of information with you or wanted to improve local democracy. It was created because they wanted to make a business. They wanted to make a vehicle for advertising. And most media is a business, even, you know, public service. It may take on public service values, and it may be quite self-conscious about the noble things that it does. But in itself, it has to work as a business model. And I think that that's where I think the argument for network journalism comes in. You start with the argument that it sustains the business model, that you can't stand where you are because your audience is disappearing. Network journalism, as far as I can see, is a great way to both improve your content, to news gather, but also to reconnect with the public and with the audience. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person has to, you know, partake of it in a, you know, in a content generation, but I think that it offers the media a way out of what I think is a crisis, not of trust, not even necessarily of economics, because you can always find a way of delivering advertising or pricing. For me, the real crisis is of relevance. We in the media have stumbled on for decades now, producing stuff that people kind of paid for, but it was almost ritualistic. We asked ourselves constantly, how can we entertain people and captivate their attention and get their money, especially advertisers' money, but also cover price, etc. But we didn't do a lot of work on trying to make ourselves relevant. So when people finally get a choice, the danger is that they're not choosing, the danger from my point of view as a journalist, is that they're not choosing the products we made. And you're quite right, as I say, in a sense that the danger is not that the mainstream media is going to be swamped by citizen journalism. It's going to be that the citizen isn't interested. So I'm sort of turning your question out. I ain't bothered if it's still relatively elitist, as long as it's engaged.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Yosef, and I'm a Reuters fellow, also a producer with ABC News in America. I'm curious about your definition of relevance, first of all. Second of all, in this notion, you have quite a utopian vision, I think, about this network journalism system. And as a member of the traditional media, I see it as there's a hell of a lot more of them than there are of us. So, in that sense, and I see, there's been, I think it's very well documented that there has been this flow toward celebrity journalism, here as well as in the States. So if that's the case, who is in this world of network journalism, who is going to be determining the agenda? And how do you prevent, let's just suppose that, these millions of people, they want more and more of Britney Spears and celebrity culture. How do you, what are we supposed to do about that? And how is that to be prevented? This kind of utopic vision is dependent on the fact that everybody is, or a large majority of people are going to be desiring quote unquote important stories. But what if that's not? But what if that ends up not being the case? I think it's very dire in the sense that every time I see the most emailed or most viewed articles, I'm appalled.
Yeah.
It's always, at least here, it's stories about Man U against Chelsea, or and you have celebrity stories that take the most emailed or most read on the ABC News website, for instance, on a regular basis. So how do you prevent this kind of dystopia?
Yeah. Well, if you notice, it is interesting that that you say it's a sort of utopian vision, because if you noticed in that, I never once said that network journalism couldn't just create stories about Britney Spears. You know, there's nothing intrinsic to network journalism that somehow makes it what you're talking about. This is partly a historical thing. I think, and the book deals a lot more with that argument which you're making around quality, which I think, that's why I prefer the word relevance, because firstly, I think the whole problem of quality has been around forever. I profoundly disagree with people who say that quality has declined. I think there's more, and I think we're sharing the same adjective when we say quality. We mean elitist, intelligent, morally concerned, political, basically, journalism is what you mean, and what I mean as well. First of all, I think there's more of that than ever before. There's just a glut of the stuff. People like you and I are actually super served that stuff. There are more fine magazines, great, and the new media has brought even more of it. Endless. It's what my friend Adrian calls the Chardonnay Pinot Noir question, which is most new media people, when they start journalism enterprises, want to create what you've described, high quality, passionate, intelligent stuff. You know, the Pinot Noir of journalism. What do the people want? They want Chardonnay. And no one is out there producing it. And that worries me more, because if you do believe in a public value of journalism, then you do believe that all journalism, or more journalism, should be share some of those values and try and disseminate those values in debates around the elite idea of quality that you're describing. I would argue that network journalism doesn't guarantee that noble future, if the noble future is less Britney Spears. And I think in a sense it's a false distinction. If you look at the media, it's always combined the two. It's always sugared the pill with let's be honest, the crap, or the stuff that people really want. And it's both pointless to expect people to always want to have the quality stuff. What I think network journalism offers, partly, if you like, it's a version of the long tail argument. It offers far greater access for people to quality journalism. But I also think that the only way that you're going to get people to engage with quality journalism is not through the old elitist model of protecting it like a kind of national park, the national park system, which is starting to evolve. I think that it's always got to be competitive in the marketplace of ideas, and that's where the idea of relevance comes in. Because, frankly, if you can't convince some people, not all the people, but some people, that, I don't know, great art is important, or that democracy, for example, is important to their everyday lives, then frankly, great art and democracy are concepts that don't deserve to survive. And I would argue that network journalism, by removing the old elitist thing which says, we are going to tell you what is quality and what is important, and we are going to insist that you subsidize it in various ways, indirect and directly. And even if you don't want it, we're going to produce it. And that, I think, is an argument in favor of irrelevance. And I think that's very dangerous.
Maybe this is just supporting what you've just said, but I think your early distinction, I'm Bill Dutton at the OII, and between traditional journalism and new media journalism, I think maybe that it's not that distinction, it's the distinction between a financial model for high quality news and the rest, because I agree with you, the traditional media also follows, if it bleeds, it leads. They try to draw a market, but quality journalism was always financed by the junk. Yeah. And it was, because you'd buy a paper and get everything, and you assume that people wanted to read the quality editorials and so forth. And now we know what people want, and now we know the relative size of audiences, and we know what people dig and so forth. And so then it becomes a more serious challenge of recognizing. So I think even, I think rather than, I really like the way you're not pitting as the substitute of the new media and the old media, but seeing them as complementary. But in each agenda, it becomes how do you finance high quality investigative reporting, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe the.
And there are some, again, the example, for example, is ProPublica in the States. And I was talking to former Washington Post Steve Cole about that last week. And we were both saying what a beautiful thing ProPublica is going to be. $50 million a year to create a group of investigative journalists who will go out and do exactly what you're arguing, which is, quality journalism. And both of us, we both looked at each other and said, yeah, but it's going to be crap, isn't it? And we thought that was because it's going to be a national park. And it may not be crap, it may be marvellous, but it will have the feel of a kind of boutique museum or something. In that my experience, just in professional journalism, is that kind of relevance, quality relevant journalism, where you really hit on something, you uncovered stuff, emerged through an it emerged partly through the journalism process. Now, I'm trying to bolt network journalism onto that and say that the audience themselves, like the Fort Myers example, can not only facilitate it, but can actually make you understand what is relevant in a way that was just unimaginable before. And just as a basic business proposition, I can't see why anybody wouldn't embrace that.
Paddy Coulter, freelance journalist, but I'm currently doing some work with the university's Department of International Development, and it's on the development front I wanted to talk to you. I mean, I, like Bill, I'm intrigued by your concept of network journalism. I mean, it isn't as if the old quality media has done a tremendous job on international development. Look how long it took them to get the Ethiopian famine, or to expose Enron, or Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But there are a couple of things that you said that worried me a bit, particularly on the imagery and citizen journalists or user-generated imagery coming in. You mentioned yourself Sky's failure to check the McCann manipulated imagery. Do you talk in the book about verification? Because it didn't come up in any of the slides. And do you also talk about this problem that, I mean, the tsunami is really a tsunami for user-generated images. But when I looked at the BBC figures, yes, they now, since the tsunami, are getting a lot of photographs, but 80% of them relate to disasters, the Buncefield industrial. And that then further skews old media's love of disasters, and I mean, and the inability to pick up the development story. It's only now that we're given stories about international food crises and hunger. It was there for months and months and months. And I mean, I'd like you to say, well, network journalism will change this. It will actually improve this, but only if there is a sort of fundamental bias. It works very, very well on tsunamis and disasters.
Yeah. No, I think that's very interesting. For example, to agree with you to a degree. The tsunami one is quite an interesting example. Well, okay, we did have this extraordinary tidal wave of imagery, but it was why? Because there were loads of Westerners there who had the cameras and they had the email and they sophistication. At the same time, there were massive other floods and disasters around the world which didn't get that citizen journalism effect. So, sure, in itself, it doesn't solve the problem. Does it exacerbate it? I would argue not. On the verification front, I would actually argue that I'm broadening my sense of network journalism to include a critical approach. I mean, one of the things I argue very strongly in the book is that I welcome public skepticism about the media and a critical approach to the media as part of network journalism. Part of that public participation should also be critical. Who spotted that the Sky video was false, was fake. It was another Sky reader, viewer, who saw it and told them. It wasn't a journalist who spotted it. Who spotted that the Reuters picture of Beirut in Lebanon was fake? It was not an individual, it was a highly motivated right-wing group called Little Green Footballs who have a website. But that, I think, is something that I think is actually a terrifically important part of network journalism, that the verification will no longer be in the hands of the journalists entirely, or the professional journalists. I think that I don't want to overstate the case at all, but I think that network journalism and Reuters, for example, embraced that. Reuters now have improved their procedures so that people who want to correct what they've got wrong can do so much more easily. And that was exactly the right reaction of theirs to that problem. So watchdog role, I think, is increased. And I think also that there is a greater facility if you have, a citizenry who are more media literate, more empowered, to impact upon issues like, hang on a minute, we're in Bangladesh, we're up to our necks in water, and you're still banging on about some tourists in, Tahiti or something who've had their hotels flooded. And I think that kind of pressure will happen.
What are your feelings? What are you talking about wikis? What are your feelings about Google's attempt to produce a commercial version of Wikipedia with all sponsored entries and on the advertising, whatever the browsers are doing?
Well, in a way, I'm a bit rude about wikis in the book, because I think they're a bit clunky, actually. I think Wikipedia is just about the only wiki I know that works. And it works brilliantly because of its universality. Do you know, in a funny kind of way, I welcome Google trying to do that. If they can find another model, and it's not strictly speaking a news model, but if they can find a model for monetizing, it's a shame it's Google again, obviously, but why couldn't somebody else have done it? But if they can find a way of monetizing it, then great. I mean, Jimmy Wales found a way of monetizing Wikipedia, not particularly much. He doesn't earn a lot of money out of it, comparatively speaking. But that was one version, which was, if you like, the amateur version, and now there'll be the Google version that's more commercial. Do you know what? Where are you going to be clicking on?
Probably both, I think.
Well, that's great. If it's in the same way that I worked at Channel 4 News, which was subsidised. We lost Channel 4 10 million quid every year. I was subsidised by adverts for, I don't know, Big Brother and beer and stuff. So I'm in the ecology. The ecology is mixed. What would be worrying is if Google is the only person producing, because that doesn't work as a business model for me, not for journalism.
Okay, my name is Wangyun. I work for China News Daily, and I'm right fellow too. And first, my question is: you mentioned a model for the 21st century newsroom.
Yeah.
And would you tell me which newspaper in Britain they set up this model, or they hope to set up this model? First question. Second question, I think, do you think the network journalists reduce their budget of newsroom, and how do the network journalists change the business model of newspaper? And last one, and what's the difference between professional journalist and citizen journalist? Like John Kelly, she used to be a professional journalist. Now he published his blog. Do you think now he's a citizen journalist or professional journalist?
Yeah. He was never very professional. Like me. Which newspapers are actually doing it? Well, fun enough, the Daily Telegraph, bless it, is kind of doing it with its news wheel and its commitment to blogging. But it was recent figures, which was, I thought, quite phenomenal in terms of the uptake, and this is just about their online websites. They're all catching up, basically, in terms of online usage. But what they're not necessarily doing is the network journalism stage. The way it's going to happen, I mean, it always works more easily with both specialisms and with local areas. So, for example, if you're interested, go to Paul Bradshaw's website, because he links on to various other newspapers who are starting to experiment. Liverpool Daily Post is experimenting very self-consciously with the idea of network journalism, beat reporters, as you Americans call them, where, I don't want to get bogged down in too much practicalities, but say you're a sports correspondent, every time you report on a football match, you'll link to a whole series of other blogs. You'll actually report about what the other blogs are saying about the football match. So there's lots of little practical things going on now. And in the States, it's more advanced, especially in the regional media, partly because they have better resources, and partly because they're fighting for their lives, where they're consciously trying to do what I've described. There was a very good post, I couldn't remember where it was, could I? By a local newspaper, I'll give somebody the link afterwards, where they actually took a story and deliberately tried to do it in a more network journalism way, just like that funny diagram, and it's fascinating to see how they integrated people more. What other examples? The other good reference is to go to newassignment.net, which is Professor, what's his name?
Jay Rosen.
Thank you, Jay Rosen. Straight in my head. Jay Rosen at New York University. And he is working with various media organizations to create forms of network journalism. I mean, when I was in New York the other day, some local newspaper had got all its readers to go out, a bit like, those kind of happening things. Go out the door, go to your off license, find out the price of a can of Budweiser, and then email us back. And they did this thing. So they managed to get a map of the price of Budweiser across New York, which I think is really useful. That's relevance. And you just think about that model for 1 second. And I think mapping is quite a good way to think about network journalism. When you start thinking about the kind of maps you can create around events or around issues, and multi-dimensional maps, with Google Map and photos and video and so on built in. And that is starting to happen. People are starting to do it. Obviously, the BBC, bless it, is doing it. Although with them, they're very limited in how far they can go because of the charter. The business model. You were saying, what was the business model?
Reduce the budget of newsroom. How do you think about
the budget of the newsroom? The budget of the newsroom is going down. And I think that's partly a very sensible thing, because you don't need as many journalists in the future. And this is I wouldn't say this in front of my colleagues, but, I would. You don't need as many journalists doing the same old stuff, which was mainly about recycling other people's material, because people can do that. As Jarvis says, do what you do best and link to the rest. We have an enormous amount of replication. So budgets, they'll be saving money by sacking journalists, basically. And I would argue that if they've got any sense, they'll be reusing that budget to create networks where they can do this other fantastic thing. There's it may only be 1% of the audience, but 1% of the audience who are prepared to make content for me for free is one of the great business propositions of the age. Citizen journalism is this terrific thing where people, don't ask to be paid, except in, relevance and value. And what's the difference between professional and the citizen journalist? Well, I think, as I described, I still think that there are the roles, the journalistic roles. I think the distinction between professional and citizen always has been a bit meaningless. I know in some media markets, they're more insistent upon the regulation of journalists and qualifications and so on. I've always been instinctively hostile to that, because I think it restricts press freedom and I think it restricts access. And I think the logical extension of that point of view is to say that a citizen journalist is somebody who makes journalism, or sorry, a journalist is somebody who makes journalism that other people consume. I'm not too bothered about any other qualification.
My name is Keema London, and I work for a Finnish Business Daily, quality paper, which runs also News Wire, and we do news to the television and radio and so on, and got magazine and printed paper and so on, and we have lost some audiences during the last years. All right. I will start my Reuters fellowship program next autumn, and I look forward to it. But I will tell you a story about one of the most frustrating jobs we have got nowadays, for example, in our newsroom. We run an internet platform for example, small stock investors, speculators who spread their rumors and things and which have no relevance at all. They want to have and show their own name in the net and later in the paper. So one of the most frustrating things during our evening shift is to make these web discussions into a printable version, and then we print it to next morning in the paper. And the budget of our newsroom has gone down already, and people have been, part of them have been sacked last year. But thinking about the relevance and trust of the paper, and I'm afraid that actually we put the pros and cons about that platform, discussion platform for small investors. I think the pros is that we have succeeded to link those people into our brand, media brand, okay? But the cons are, I'm afraid that when we print it again, could that actually diminish our readers who paste the paper? And it's one way of recycling. Again, you mentioned that the quality papers, they recycled same stories again and again. Well, we are recycling these rumors again and again, and I'm afraid that the trust of our paper will go down, and after that also the audiences. I have also wondered with whose work time do they spread those rumors and write the stories to the platform.
Well, I think it's a very interesting issue, area around financial journalism. It's one that's kind of generally neglected. POLIS is doing a report which will be out in the autumn looking at financial journalism in the digital environment, because people haven't paid much attention, well, not until Northern Rock went down and the credit crunch started. But there's been an extraordinary shift over the last few years in the way that financial data is processed. The old idea that people would pick up the FT and look through the stock prices and make investment decisions on that, or that people would, even Bloomberg is almost becoming out of date, in that people can now, because of new media technology, anybody involved in the financial sector gets their information direct. The same stuff that goes up on stockbrokers' screens is available to everybody in infinite varieties, highly specialized, constant and up to date. So in a sense, the problem is, the question I would ask is, what I don't want to personalize it, but what, if you like, what are you providing? Now, you're quite right. If what you're providing is recycling of some of the kind of financial new media blogs, that go alongside that data, then I'd question why you're doing that, not just for moral reasons, but I'd question it for business reasons, really, which is, what are you bringing to that? If it's that you're bringing a guide to the sewer of misinformation and disinformation, well, I think that's actually quite a valid and interesting function that you can do. And I think that the whole point of it, and I think this is something we're seeing more generally in journalism, is a greater transparency. So if you're saying to people, here's a list of rumours, here's a list of things we've seen on the internet, you may be interested. But if you're saying, here are the rumours, and we think this one's, they're rubbish for these various reasons, that's actually increasing transparency. And I think it's something you see across all media, actually, where journalists are more prepared to say, not this is the truth, but this is some data, this is some opinion that is out there. We try and contextualize it, and we're trying to process it, but we're offering it for your inspection, rather than trying to come to some final ultimate truth that you then unleash upon the world. So I think that's your difficulty, and I think that's why your brand doesn't have to be compromised by, dealing in that kind of world. It's a bit like gossip columns have always been part of newspapers, showbiz gossip. But obviously the difference with financial information is that it matters in terms of money and in terms of the economy. So wait for the report to come out in the autumn and see what Damien Tambini has made of that particular issue. But I think that increasingly we do have to put you have to put your sort of your gloves on and wade into the filth.
Well, I understand why.
We've always done it. I mean, it used to be the way around. It used to be that mainstream media produced most of the filth, actually. And I'm sure your organisation didn't, but it's always somebody else. So I think that a lot of what I say in there, about this, the idea that journalists aren't gatekeepers anymore. Well, they may not be gatekeepers, but they can still be people who, as I say, try and create those brands where you go to because you think you'll have a more intelligent analysis about the data that's out there.
I understand that in the network platform it works all right. You got the rumors and you got the discussion and so on, but to print the whole mess into a paper, I feel like...
I think it's a bit odd that you're printing it full stop, frankly.
It's mildly edited.
Sounds like it would work better as a website to me, to be a roundup of the filthy rumours. And I talk about this in the book in a political context, in that I talk about the role of, in Britain particularly, of political blogs, which are often scurrilous, and they're often manipulated by people who are trying to leak information deliberately. Well, actually, that's a description of political journalism in Britain for the last 20 years, actually. But my point with that is that not the older argument, as Bill said, the old argument was kind of old media versus new media. Were these blogs taking over from our trusted political journalists? No, they're not. They're now in a relationship with each other where the information circulates, and our lovely journalists. I mean, bear in mind, where did the Monica Lewinsky story come out? It came out from Matt Drudge. Did Matt Drudge come up with that story on his own? No, he didn't. It was a journalist on the LA Times who'd actually got the story, and just his editor wouldn't put it out, so he gave it to Matt Drudge to leak. So it's that kind of relationship I think will be more obvious, and obviously there are all sorts of ethical problematics, but that's nothing new.
Well, Charlie, you had talked about entering Wangyun. Maybe this is a way to save money, and some of that reverse publishing rationale is used in the U.S. with smaller papers taking stuff from the citizen journalistic user-generated content arena and putting it in the paper. But from what I've seen and what I've decided is I don't know if there's a cost savings in that, because there is a cost to editing it, to vetting it. I mean, if you're bothering to do any of that, there's the potential that advertisers actually are not interested in being in an environment of user-generated content as opposed to professional journalism. So I don't know whether actually the money-saving part of it or the money moving resources saved here put somewhere else is, will turn out really to be valid.
Yeah, neither do I. I mean, I think if you talk to advertisers, they're also learning about, they've got a very similar issue. It's not just the journalist. The advertiser's got a similar problem in that, they want to deliver eyeballs or interest to their products, and they're also experimenting with different ways of understanding how, and I think one of the ways that it's this relevance thing again, that the one thing that advertisers desperately want is to be able to reach a target audience. And if they're, in the past, it was a leap in the dark. They'd stick an advert into a newspaper. They'd hope that their target audience would turn onto that particular page. The joy of new media, and especially of a more network media where the editorial organisation, if you like, is more conscious and aware of who their audience is because they're constantly dialoguing with them. It seems to me that's actually that's quite a good thing for advertisers as well. If if the Daily Telegraph online really does know exactly where their audience have come from, who they are, what they had for breakfast, what their points of view are, what they're interested in, that seems, and it's a relationship of trust, seems to me like a great advertising model, But, we're still all working it out.
My name's Elizabeth Jackson. I work for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And whilst, it's been interesting, we've been discussing that, yes, people can send in their photos, and certainly the ABC receives a lot of that kind of material and it's featured on the website. But I'm still struggling to understand how Joe and Susan average out there can ultimately impact on your 7 p.m. news bulletin in the evening, or even the current affairs radio programs that I'm involved in, producing 3 of them a day. I still don't really get how they can ultimately have a voice in setting that agenda. Perhaps you would argue that those programs will soon become a thing of the past. I know other people have, and that it's the internet is the domain of the future. But I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And then just secondly, working for a public broadcaster, it does create some problems in this area for me. I know you did mention that the BBC is hamstrung by its charter, and we would find ourselves in a similar position. But, the comments that you made about accuracy, for example, I wouldn't be allowed to take that attitude. At the ABC, we've currently undergone an accuracy audit where a number of our stories have been randomly picked from our programs, and we have been held accountable, and we are incredibly accountable, and we are scrutinised. And they rank the mistakes, material mistake, immaterial mistake, this mistake, that mistake. But we are accountable. We have to write written responses to that. And so the ABC, I guess, like the BBC, really values the integrity that it has with its audience, although it does accept that the audience is disappearing. That is a problem. But that's a real conflict area for us, and I wonder how can that be resolved?
Yeah. No is probably the answer. On the first one, on how it impacts on bulletins, for example. I used to work on Channel 4 News. I used to edit Channel 4 News, which is a classic old media thing. It's a live 1-hour news show in a studio, with a white-haired presenter, very live, lots of discussions and so on. It's appointment to view television. 1 million people, for some reason, decide to spend an hour every evening watching it. Now, doesn't necessarily change. As I said, not all journalism suddenly has to shift. That's actually a very efficient way of delivering a certain amount of information. Again, I've probably accentuated the utopian, revolutionary nature to get the debate going. But a lot of the time I spend in the book is actually the first chapter, half of it is actually a defence of traditional journalism in many ways. Partly because journalists, generally speaking, are quite good at what they do. It's quite competitive. They're quite good at, some of them are quite knowledgeable, and they're quite good at packaging and all that kind of stuff. and some journalistic things like newspapers, TV shows and so on are quite efficient ways of delivering and quite entertaining and attractive ways of delivering information. So the idea that they're suddenly going to be abandoned and turned into my kind of kibbutz commune of network journalism with, what did you call them?
Joe and Susan Avery.
Yeah, Joe and Susan Avery's kind of barging into the studio and, pushing weathercasters aside isn't going to happen like that. But I do know that, as you said, that in fact, Channel 4 News, by the way, its audience has slightly grown actually at this time of crisis. So there will always be an appetite for quality. But I think that you're right to assume that that's pretty unsustainable or very difficult to sustain in the future. And therefore, you'll be looking to ways of, as I say, securing that relevance, getting people involved. And the BBC is a good example where they still do all that clunky bulletin stuff, but underneath, like the duck, they're paddling away with the user-generated content, with increased interactivity, and they're looking to push that out into quite an interesting and possibly controversial area of actual civic engagement as well. So what I tried to get across there was that, in a way, that the user-generated content being kind of emailed in a sense, is the least interesting part of it. Far more interesting is the involvement in the wider process of the journalism production. One quick example from the BBC, when they were trying to investigate soldiers' families, the effect, coming back from Iraq. Very, very difficult to do with traditional media. So they put something up on their website and they start to get people emailing with an amazing amount of detail from service families and so on about the story. Now, see, I think that is more important than reading out emails on the 7 o'clock news or having even user-generated material coming in. I think there's these other ways that people can become integrated in the process. Second question was about accuracy. Well, I sort of refer you to my previous answer, which is I agree with you that part of accountability is about having it's that branded community idea, if you like. One branded community will be public service regulated type journalism. That's one way of expressing it. But and there'll be a whole host of others. But I think that I don't think that network journalism at any point compromises accuracy. I'm not quite sure how it does, particularly, because I think that in the past you will have made mistakes. You will have been inaccurate.
But I'll also be accountable.
Indeed, and you'll.
I then become accountable for Joe's mistakes, as you read.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Oh, bugger that.
Yeah, but in the same way that you're accountable for your, I don't know what you're a producer or reporter, but especially in broadcast media, it was always a question of systems and networks. I'm not, so I think that this model works particularly well, funny enough, I think, with broadcast mindsets, because they're already used to working more as, say, a network of people, and you work with for example, a videotape editor who's not necessarily a journalist. I spent half my life working with people, cameramen and so on, who had profound influences on the material I made, and yet they weren't journalists, and they'd never compromised the accuracy. In many ways, they were a very useful bulwark of common sense, and they could spot bullshit a mile off and would make you more accurate. So I think in that sense, all you're talking about is integrating a wider network into the process. There are people out there, as you know, who know far more about any given subject than you do. They can make you more accurate. They can make you more informed. So my thing would be not to stop worrying about accuracy, but stop worrying about the idea that being more open and more integrated is somehow going to compromise that. I think the benefits outweigh it.
I mean, there's an example of, I don't think anybody would argue that the old media are going to be dinosaurs because of the new new media. In fact, the exact opposite, because the old media have all the deep pockets, all the resources to use new media to support their own maintenance and enhancement. Like Australian Broadcasting Corporation has this wonderful colleague, Robin Williams, who does tremendous interviews with individuals across the world. And previously, those interviews were only accessible to radio listeners in Australia. Now they're online, accessible through the network, on podcasts, packaged as learning, on physics, so you can hear Einstein to...
But I wonder how Robin would respond to the notion that his audience contributes.
Well, it depends.
Well, his audience is telling him, they're I bet he's interested in what they listen to from his... But yeah, no, but that's a really interesting, because he just uses this reel-to-reel tape recorder and everything. But yet he's through the help of Australian Broadcasting Corporation, using new media to make his content more accessible across time and across the world. And so you're using the media to support it. But in terms of trust and integrity, we've interviewed people in the UK. People trust what they can get online more than they do print journalism. Of course, you can get print journalist coverage online, but you can get other things. And I think the reason why is that people go to search engines and they trust and they get good material, but the search engines are becoming the new gatekeeper. Mm. And in that respect, I want to go back to your comment about Google. I think Google Knoll is the beginning of the end for Google, in my view. Mm. It's they're getting into vertical integration, and we will stop trusting Google.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about it, and I think that's a huge mistake for them. And I think, and that goes back to integrity, and the reason why network journalism may be valuable. Another point that you could add to your list is its independence from existing institutions.
Yeah.
So the journalists are not dependent upon Google. Well, Google Knoll, now they become dependent on Google to publish their work, et cetera. So I think independence of the network journalists from existing institutions adds to the integrity, I think.
Yeah. I think the integrity thing is the transparency of new media. With all you have to make all the caveats about digital divides and so on. But I think the one thing that I found profoundly shocking, I blog, for example, so that's my little way of dipping my toes into it, and various other bits of journalism I do, which is now so much more accountable than it was before. And in a good way, in that a lot of journalists, and I think Jackie Ashley was talking about this in Oxford last week, feel very upset about the vituperative comments that they get because their work is suddenly exposed to Joe Public. And my instant reaction is, well, try and turn it around. Try and think, how can you harness that rather than always fearing it? The basic business proposition, as I said, about citizen journalism, that it's free, but also the other one, which I really, really like, is they care enough to, slag me off or to occasionally praise, but if they care that much, even if it's 1% of people care that much to be bothered to email or post or send in their pictures, I think that's an extraordinary thing. It's something that is gold dust for politicians and for marketeers. So why should journalists be so worried about it? Most people want attention. Journalists, I spent my whole journalistic life desperately trying to get attention for what I was doing, because most of it was deathly dull. It was the quality stuff, So I just don't worry about. Sorry, I don't worry. I worry. Of course, I worry about accuracy and so on. But I think it actually brings a degree of attention, relevance, and accountability. The task, and it's a very difficult one, which we're all going to have to, as journalists or generally in society, going to have to relearn, is how we handle that. And increasingly, the products of J schools, etc., are going to be about how you cope morally ethically, practically, technologically with that new relationship. So where before you would learn the BBC producer guidelines, which of course are engraved on my heart, you would learn those and that would be your guide. But increasingly those are going to become far less relevant. Well, sorry, not far less relevant, but less useful in dealing not just with new situations, but with, I think, new ethical. I'm trying to avoid the word standards, but I think when you are sharing, traditionally as a journalist, for example, with opinions, you would try and find representative opinions. If you made an article or something, you would try and choose people who represented opinion. How do you do that if people have access almost automatically? The BBC finds this very difficult. The BBC has a very profound debate at the moment about whether it ought to open up its websites, its online space, to the public in a much more direct, unmediated way. I think in a way it's a sort of semantic argument, really, but because they would then lose control over that. So it's how on earth do you negotiate those spaces, how do you create those spaces, and how do you manage them, that are going to be the tasks that we were not used to handling as journalists before. But I think they're windows on the world, they're ways of dragging the public in, and if we don't want that, then we must be mad.
Hi, I'm Dominique Jackson, no relation to Elizabeth. I'm ex-Guardian, Reuters, FT. Just wanted to ask you, Charlie, have you had any time in the book to address the whole monetizing financial side of things? Because obviously the technology is making the traditional business model crumble. And Bill made a very good point earlier on about, with the internet, we can now quantify all this stuff. They know where the people are coming from, they know who they are, but it seems to me that nobody's really doing it yet. I mean, the Guardian and the FT are way ahead, but they're still very subsidised. The Telegraph is playing catch-up. Have you had time in the book to address how they're going to monetize these things? And a lot of the kind of current advertising, cost per click is 0.000 of a penny per click. Now, that's not going to sustain a major media operation, is it?
No. I mean, and if I had the answer to that, I would not be sitting here. I would be talking to Rupert Murdoch about where I wanted my office. Did I want it facing the Hudson River, or did I want, No, of course. I mean, just in the last week, I had dinner with the managing editor of the Sunday Mirror, who has got no idea how he's going to make money online. No idea. He's got a big problem because he edits something called the Sunday Mirror when the whole world has gone 24/7. He's got a huge problem. What will happen is he'll stop being the Sunday Mirror. I was speaking to a leading executive at, let's name them, at RDF, funnily enough, the company that brought you the Queen documentary, and as if they hadn't got enough problems. They've got a digital division. She's got no idea how they're going to make money. They've done a deal with something like MySpace, and they put some of their wife swap material on it or something, and they're hoping that it will lead people back to their website. But as you say, the clicks at the moment just aren't producing enough. So absolutely, the old model where somebody paid for space in the media, or they paid for bits of the media in return for the content, are going to go. My point is that people have got to stop thinking just about content, and they've got to start thinking about relationships. In the past, it was good enough. It was almost somebody else worried about the relationship. I would kind of make a program, and somebody else would worry about where the money came. In fact, in the 8 years I was at Channel 4 News, the advertising executive only ever came to the studio once. It was in the last few months that I was there, and he turned up and talked to everyone and explained how much money we were losing for them. And I thought that was really interesting, that we had no concept of how we were funded and how we reached our audience and so on. So I think that actually part of, again, the J School training is going to be an understanding of how the business model evolves. And the reason isn't just because they're going to have to become more economically literate. The point is that your content to find its audience and to find its funder, if you like, I think works best in network journalism, because it works absolutely by trying constantly to create relationships and communities with the public. That way, you at least have a way, partly in a practical sense, of identifying who's interested, but also of understanding the value of it. You know, what is the value of that journalistic process to those people? Now, I would argue that that is at least quite a long way down the road to then saying to those people, if you like, or having, you know, if we value it so much, what are we prepared to invest in it or to pay to have that thing there? At the moment, it's not working yet, although individual online sites, it's interesting, like The Guardian's and one or two others, have now become in themselves profitable, albeit that doesn't pay for the other bit of The Guardian, you know, the real bit of The Guardian that actually produces most of the content that goes on the online bit. But there are indications that, first of all, I don't think it's so, you know, the basic economic facts are there's a bunch of advertising out there, it's going to go somewhere. Journalism has to find ways to make sure it goes to them. When I say advertising, I mean other forms as well. Same way that has to make the case for public service subsidy and find a way of doing it. And that is bloody difficult. And in this country, for example, it's going to be very, very painful for all concerned, because the BBC is going to lose money to Channel 4, it seems. So the answer is that I haven't got the answer. But I'm convinced that just hoping that you can find some clever way of subsidising the old or financing the old model, I don't know anybody that thinks like that.
Hi, I'm a sociology master's student here, so I seem a little different than most of the other people in this room. I've got a couple of questions, which seem to be kind of the same issues that have been talked about recently, but specifically related to intellectual property, okay. And possibly the issues of trying to monetize the content that you have and providing access to it, as opposed to, I think the irony is that for the longest time that news in particular has been provided free of charge, in a sense, in terms of it's put on the airwaves, or it's in the sense that all of that content is available for people to get access to, rather than try to be sold the content itself the way a movie is sold, or say the DVDs. You know, you don't get the box set of Channel 4 for, you know, the last 3 months.
Not unless you're really sad.
Yeah. Yeah, so whether, I mean, I think the precedent has already been set that that's not kind of an option for news media, but possibly, and it's certainly a battleground for media in general, and the major traditional content providers.
Yeah.
And partly how that kind of thing interacts with what people would call the semantic web as it's developing, in the sense that content, instead of it just here's a news story and here's the author of the news story, actually taking and trying to organize all the content in that story in an analyzable format, a bit like the Katrina example you gave, but in the sense that content itself can be analyzed.
Yeah.
And whether that might provide another major change in how that possible future will affect journalism. And I mean, what seems to be in the kind of elephant in the room for me in terms of how you guys are going to pay for all of this stuff is what Google has been very good at doing, which is tracking exactly what people are doing and selling that information on and monetizing the actual behavior of users. And to me, I always presumed that was the big issue from a trust perspective, perhaps. You know, whether I trust Facebook with all of my content, in exchange for all of these little applications that they'll allow me to attach to my user profile.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not sure if that's a question per se, but
Yeah.
those are some of the issues I was thinking about.
I think it's interesting that the funny old thing about news is that nobody owns it. You know, it's a funny business. It's telling you a load of stuff. It's all about you know, process. It's telling you a load of stuff. There is no one owns Hurricane Katrina. You know, you can't say, no, we got here first. It's our story, in the same way that you can, as you say, with a Hollywood movie. Doesn't mean there isn't capital in news, in the sense, for example, archives are extremely valuable commodities. And I would argue that archive can be extended, in a sense, to a kind of intellectual, cultural archive. There's the knowledge and continuity within media brands that is in itself a kind of property. It's that idea of community of brands, branded communities. I do talk in the book about the ideas of, you know, intellectual property rights and net neutrality and so on, but mainly to argue that against regulation. I don't have a particular ideological stand. For example, I think it's entirely reasonable for, I think the FT still charges people to go on bits of its website. Times Higher Education Supplement, I think, charges you. The Wall Street Journal, has that just changed its mind? I can't remember which way around it is. But yeah, if you want to do that, if you want to fence off what you produce, I have no problem with that at all. I see no idealistic issue there at all. However, I think that most, and this comes to a second point, the fact that, I mean, never mind the semantic web, this is already happening in the sense that RSS feeds, I saw a brilliant bit of software the other day in the States where you can personalize your newspaper, and it changes your online newspaper page, and it changes as you, if you're obsessed by basketball and you keep clicking on the basketball stories, it spots that and it shoves the basketball up to the front, that kind of stuff. Quite mechanistic, but, you know, increasingly, as you say, with the more semantic web, it will start. Now, all that accentuates the idea that people aren't coming to journalism to buy, you know, the DVD of a particular movie. They're entering into a relationship, and you have to make your relationship, you know, you have to show love and relevance and care about the other person in the relationship, who is the public, in a way you didn't have to do before. And partly, I think the technological issue around how you do that around RSS feeds and so on I think it's largely technological. I think that most people want diversity and variety, but they also want coherence. And the experience seems to be, if you look at the way that people map the blogosphere, is that it's not random, it is mappable. And if it's mappable, then there is space there for dynamic structures who are able to provide the material that people are going to want, or the relationship that people are going to want. And they're called, you know, they can be called a newspaper or a news channel. So, you know, I obviously want net neutrality. The biggest fear is that in that relationship, if it becomes so influenced by, you know, for example, Google, or by the commercialization and distortion of search, for example, which is already happening, then you end up effectively with the sort of Murdochization of the internet, in the same way that I'm very happy for Rupert to be there as long as there's enough competition, and he's very transparent. He stands up and says, yeah, I sure as hell tell my editors what to think, or at least the tabloid ones. You know, that's, for me, it's relatively transparent, it's relatively measurable. How you do that, how you measure that influence online is obviously much harder. So that's where I suppose we creep towards dystopia.
just want to say thank you very much for accepting our invitation, coming over here. It's so very interesting.
Thank you.